When authorities say a death was a suicide, most people accept it without hesitation, because believing that someone chose to end their own life feels simpler than accepting that something darker might have happened. It gives the story an ending. It removes responsibility, and it allows everyone else to move on. But what if the conclusion depends on ignoring one small detail that changes everything? This file shows how easily a final answer can be built on something that doesn't make sense. According to the official report, the victim was found alone. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of a struggle. The position of the body, combined with the scene, led investigators to one conclusion: suicide. The report states it clearly, calmly, confidently. The case was closed shortly after. And once again, the word closed did more work than the evidence itself. At first glance, nothing seems unusual. This is how most people experience these cases. A headline, a short summary, a conclusion that feels sad but understandable. But files are not meant to be read quickly. They're meant to be examined slowly. And when you do that with this one, something immediately feels wrong. Not dramatic, not obvious, just wrong enough to matter. Inside the report, there's a description of the body's position, the way it was found, the orientation, the distance. These details exist for a reason. They are not decoration. They are physics. They are limits on what a human body can and cannot do. And in this case, the position described does not align with the method listed as the cause of death. It's not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of mechanics. Here's why this matters. If the body was positioned the way the report claims, then the action required to cause the death becomes extremely unlikely without external involvement. Not impossible in theory, but inconsistent in practice. Investigators are trained to notice this. They are taught to question it, yet in this file, the detail is recorded and then ignored. No follow-up explanation, no alternative scenario, just silence. Most people assume that if something doesn't make sense, it would be corrected, that someone would catch it, that there are safeguards. But real systems don't work like that. Real systems prioritize closure. Once a narrative forms early, everything else gets filtered through it. Details that support the narrative are emphasized. Details that challenge it are noted, then quietly sidelined. There's another part of the file that deepens the discomfort. A note about the time between the estimated moment of death and when the body was discovered. That window is crucial. It determines who could have been present. It determines what could have happened unnoticed. In this case, the window is unusually tight, almost too convenient, and yet no explanation is offered for how investigators ruled out other possibilities so quickly. This is where people often say, maybe they knew something we don't. Maybe there was more evidence. Maybe it just wasn't included in the report. But that's the problem. Official conclusions should be supported by what's written, not by assumptions about what might exist somewhere else. If the explanation isn't in the file, then the file is incomplete, and an incomplete file should never produce a final ruling. What makes this case especially unsettling is how ordinary it is. There are no shocking photos, no dramatic statements, no emotional language, just clean formatting and confident wording. It looks professional, trustworthy, and that's exactly why the contradiction is so dangerous. Because when something looks official, people stop questioning it. Now imagine how this affects the people closest to the case. When a ruling like this is made, it doesn't just close an investigation. It closes conversations. It shuts down doubts. It labels further questions as denial or conspiracy. The moment the word suicide is stamped onto a file, challenging it becomes socially unacceptable, even when the details don't align. Here's the hardest truth in this file. No one had to lie for this conclusion to stand. No cover-up was required. All that was needed was one detail to be inconvenient, and for everyone involved to keep moving forward anyway. This is how many errors survive. Not through malice, but through momentum. By the final pages of the report, the contradiction is never addressed again. The position of the body is no longer mentioned. The timeline is summarized. The conclusion is repeated, and the case is closed. Officially, permanently, the detail that ruins the explanation still exists in the file, but it has no power. Because once a conclusion is accepted, evidence stops being examined and starts being archived. This file forces an uncomfortable realization. The truth doesn't always lose because it's weak. Sometimes it loses because it's inconvenient, because acknowledging it would require reopening questions no one wants to answer. And once it happens, the system protects the conclusion, not the consistency. If there's one thing you should take from this, it's this. Never trust a conclusion more than you trust the details that support it, especially when those details involve physical reality, bodies, space-time. These things don't bend to narrative. If they don't align, the story is wrong. No matter how official it sounds, this case remains ruled a suicide. The detail that contradicts it remains unaddressed, and the file remains closed, not because it makes sense, but because reopening it would require admitting that the first answer may have been wrong. This was File 002, and one detail ruined everything.